Hello everyone, welcome, Happy New Year. It's also this evening another day which actually precedes the New Year, and that is the 10th of Tevis. So these 2 days don't usually coincide. The 10th of Tevis is a sad day, a fast day, which commemorates the siege around Jerusalem by the Babylonians over 2,300 years ago of the first temple. And to commemorate that, every year we fast on this day. It goes into the category, as the book of Ezekiel spells it out, the category of the fast days, the siege which began on the 10th of Tevis, which approximately Tevis Shvat, Adar, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, 6 months later, they finally breached the wall of Jerusalem, and 3 weeks later, they burned the temple down, which is Tisha B'Av. So you have the 10th of Tevis, you have the 17th of Tammuz, 6 months later, then you have 3 weeks after that, the 9th of Av, the saddest day in the calendar. So it's part of one cycle. I thought it would be interesting to discuss the contrast between these two New Year's and 10th of Tevis. In a titled class, Do You Have Healthy Boundaries? New Year versus 10th of Tevis. I want to begin that the class is dedicated in honor of Gabriel upon his 19th birthday. A mazel tov to you on the 9th of Tevis for his strength, courage, and giving so much nachas, dedicated by his loving mother, Goldie, our dear friend. Thank you for that, and may this class and all the teachings and anyone it inspires and touches and motivates to make this world a little better place be in honor of the birthday boy, Gabriel. So let's get straight into the topic. The topic will be the issue of boundaries. The juxtaposition of 10th of Tevis and New Year's seems to be very obvious. 10th of Tevis was, they lay siege to Jerusalem, the walls around Jerusalem. When you travel now to Israel and you see the walled city, obviously those walls were built later, but they were the area where the first walls were first there, surrounding Jerusalem. And for 6 months, the Babylonians laid siege until they finally breached the walls. So one could wonder, why is that considered to be a sad day? We understand it was the beginning of the end, so to speak, but the burning down of the temple, even the breach of the walls. But why 3 fast days, beginning from the siege around the wall? So clearly there's something about the wall and the siege around the wall that has significance. And as I always ask the question, and the focus of this class has always been, what is its relevance to our lives today? So there's the wall. What is a walled city about? A wall protects the city, and you have gates that allow those that you want to enter and to leave. In truth, everything in life has walls and boundaries and gates, as we shall discuss. New Year's is known for the New Year's parties, throwing a New Year's party. Come midnight tonight, as the ball falls at midnight, and the New Year is counted down, whether it's in Times Square or any parts of the world, you'll see it's commemorated and it's honored and celebrated with unbridled partying, drinking galore, and actually the breakdown of boundaries and borders almost across the board in every particular area, for good and for bad. So in stark contrast to that, you have here a day called 10th of Tevis, which focuses on and reminds us of the dangers of the breaching of walls and boundaries and the importance of respecting them. So one has to discuss what exactly are boundaries. And I think the questions can be posed in several ways. Are there lines that one should never cross, even if you're a free spirit and a bohemian? Why is it important to maintain healthy boundaries, even in the highest moments of joy, love, and transcendence? How does one achieve that balance? What is the role of definitions, structures, and parameters in context of the infinite beyond? Anyone that has experienced real transcendence knows there's the infinite beyond. Let's use the words of William Blake. Can one cleanse the doors of perception and remain intact? Where he says, when the doors of perception are cleansed, you're left with the infinite. Only one thing, the pure infinite. How can one experience the boundless while bound by the narrow confines of existence? And finally, do boundaries limit or free us? So we live clearly in a world of structure. World of structure. The human body has needs. It needs to sleep, it needs to eat, it needs to drink. It has other needs. And needs, by definition, are a form of boundaries. It means you can't cross those boundaries. You don't eat long enough, God forbid, you can get sick. So life is defined by parameters, and by structures, and by so-called rules of nature. We're not discussing now the ones that are superimposed by society and by culture. Just the natural boundaries is enough. On the other hand, which person on earth does not experience sometimes that boundless sense of enthusiasm, adventure, free abandon, the need to just break out of it all? And we see it today, we see it very often done through music, it can be done through dance. You just let go of everything and just soar to the heavens. And yet at the same time we still remain grounded to earth, because by our definition, by our nature. And we've seen people, especially geniuses and artists and people of great spirit and energy, who had very big difficulty. Part of their life's challenges was this: how do you balance? How do you reconcile? How do you integrate the two? Many have been hurt in the process. The concept of what we call in Hasidic and Kabbalistic language, rotzeh without a shuv, where there's a yearning, there's such a deep tension and yearning and craving and pining for something greater and not being able to contain it. People have OD'd, people have in other ways been self-destructive, and other forms of inability to bring these two worlds together. So the challenge of living in a world of boundaries while also trying to experience the boundless is not a simple matter. It has many implications, philosophical ones, psychological ones, emotional ones. And one could even argue that a healthy life is defined by the proper formula, a methodology of balancing these two forces. I mentioned this many times, the cardiologist that comes often to the class, and he tells me about his difficult life, the divorce he's going through, and other challenges. He says, why can't things just be calm and peaceful? So jokingly, half-jokingly, I would say to him, you mean like a flat line? He says, no, not that. Because we all know a flat line in a cardiogram is not exactly a sign of health. It means death, actually. A heart, the beat of the heart is a perfect cycle. Perfect dips and perfect peaks and valleys. And the right balance. If it's not in that balance, the peaks go too high or the valleys too low, then you have an erratic and unstable and anxious life. But a healthy human being has to have a combination of angst, a measure of angst that motivates you, that troubles you, that you're restless and want more. At the same time, the ability to resolve, resolution, tension, resolution. That balance is not easy to do, especially when you do have deep cravings, and all of us do. One could even argue that every addiction, even the unhealthiest addictions, at its root, at its core, the kernel, is driven by a deep need, a deep hunger, a deep thirst. When it's not achieved through healthy means, it's achieved through unhealthy ones. Very passionate people will be far more addicted than people who are less passionate and more complacent. So for example, someone who's very thirsty and you're looking for a drink desperately, whatever comes your way. If it's healthy water, great. But if it's not, if it's something that is unhealthy, toxic, you can end up killing or destroying or hurting yourself. So the deep thirst is not an unhealthy thing. The deep thirst is something, is a need. Depends how you fill that need. So the concept of reaching upward, reaching into the heavens, into the skies, is the matter of so much, the stuff of so much poetry, romance, art, music, and all the experiences that human beings, the romantic experience that human beings always strive for. Love is, of course, the ultimate example. Love is a form of just getting beyond it all, getting outside of the tedious regimen and the tedious routines and patterns of a day-to-day grind, the day-to-day grind of life, and escape and experiencing something beyond. But then the challenge is, how do you bring it back? How do you stay intact? And here's where the real question is. We live in a world, for example, today, where the boundaries are continuing to melt down more and more. Let's just take communications. You can be right here and communicating to anybody through a live stream, as I'm doing right now, anywhere. As they say, any information, anytime, anywhere. In a sense, boundaries are gone, the boundaries of time and space, where it would have taken a message to get across one part of the world to the next, hours, if not days, if not weeks, if not months, now it's instantaneous. So time and space have suddenly lost, so to speak, their boundaries in the sense that we can transcend them, and for the good. We all agree that's a positive thing. From an economic point of view, and from other political point of view, we live in a global village in many ways. Besides that, technology has destroyed the boundaries between one country and another because you can broadcast and easily cross those boundaries through the invisible forces of airwaves and sound waves and light waves. But it's also in the context of political relationships. Because of that, there's such an interconnectivity between nations that something happens in one corner of the earth, it affects the rest of the world. Even on a political level, because we live in this type of global village. Now there's still boundaries, and obviously you still have to get to the border, and you have to have a visa, and you have to have a passport, and you need that. But in many ways, these boundaries and borders too are becoming more and more porous in a certain sense. And the question is, on a more philosophical level, you can ask the question, and psychological level, about our individuality. What happens, once upon a time, we lived in a world where you grew up in a shtetl, you probably died in the same town where you grew up. Your community was a small one. Everyone knew each other by first name. And that was it. And you knew very little about cities and towns elsewhere. Maybe the surrounding cities did business with, interaction, trade, and so on. But the big world out there, no one knew that there was a big world. No one knew how many people are out there and what are they going through. But today, with the information age and technology revolution, we know about everybody knows about everything. So in the world in which we live, this type of, the question is, what happens to our individuality? As I said, when you lived in a world like that, everyone was an individual, everyone knew their family, their community, their value, and hopefully in a healthy way, it was nurtured. But once you become part of 7 billion people, though there are different cultures and races and nations and so on, but you begin to, in a sense, you can lose a sense of individuality because you just become a speck. You're no longer one of 100, one of 200, one of a few hundred families. You're now in the melting pot of billions of people. So in a certain way, you can ask the question, what does it do? How does it affect our own individuality, our own self-esteem, our own significance and contribution to the world? When you add into the equation quantum mechanics and modern physics, the concept of the butterfly effect, where we know today that the world is really one integral unit. So that too, in a way, has eliminated boundaries. Because in a sense, a little sneeze in one city creates a typhoon across the world somewhere else. And this type of impact, the microscopic impact, the impact of microscopic forces across the world in seconds, if not even that, faster than the speed of light, also tends to eliminate, so to speak, the conventional structures that once defined existence. And yet, we still live in a world of boundaries. So I want to begin, so then the question, of course, is, so how do we understand this? Especially, as I said, in our day and age. So I want to first begin by distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy boundaries. We all know there's unhealthy boundaries, which means superimposed. For example, racism is an example of unhealthy boundaries. What does that mean? That a certain group of people who may feel elitist, or they may actually feel inferior, that's why they behave like elitists, decide to discriminate and create a superimposed boundary between them and others by excluding them from their clubs, and that's on a minimal level. Or far worse, as we've seen genocide perpetrated against other races. The Jews, of course, at the brunt during World War II by the Nazis. So these are boundaries imposed by human beings who determined that they are superior to others. And as such, superimpose unnatural boundaries, unnatural walls that exclude others. This is on a more subtle level, experienced in the different laws that have changed as far as giving equality to the position of women in society, or the equality to blacks, or other so-called minorities that may have been discriminated against. That's one example. Then there's, of course, boundaries within every community when people do the same thing, bullying in schools, where you create unhealthy walls between people on a very personal level in relationships, It's a very common experience. People put up walls, defense mechanisms that don't allow one person to communicate with other due to fear, due to distrust, due to being hurt, wounds, whatever the reason may be. These are all examples of unhealthy boundaries, unhealthy walls. Some of us develop very, very sophisticated mechanisms, defense mechanisms, and layers of heavy armor just to protect ourselves because we were hurt, testing others, and creating all kinds of, again, superimposed walls. I can go on and on. There's so many examples, and you can fill in the blanks. Find an example in your life of unhealthy walls. Unhealthy walls doesn't mean that you may have good reason that you built them, but ultimately it's coming from an unhealthy place, and when it's overdone, it remains unhealthy walls that may not let anyone in, but also lets no one out. So you remain an isolated, lonely figure with very secure fortress that you live in, without your soul and heart ever really going out to protect yourself, but also no one coming in and no one going out, both ways. These are walls that we would love to be able to somewhat temper, to be able to allow for relationships to thrive. When parents put up walls to their children, when siblings put them up to each other. And then there's the walls you put up to yourself, your own fears and your own blocks and your own impediments that don't let you get to where you need to go because for some reason there's an invisible wall, an invisible barrier, and a visible iron curtain that doesn't let you get where you need to get to. Then there are healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries means boundaries that reflect the reality of individuals. For example, two people may love each other deeply. That doesn't mean there are no boundaries. There are no walls that out of fear, but the boundaries are simply your space, my space. Each person has to know that they're an individual. And individuals, they don't have to become one in the sense where they lose their individuality. So individuality has to be maintained, and the integrity of that individual sphere, that by definition creates boundaries. If, for example, the human body decided we'll have an organ convention and all the organs and limbs of the human body decide to come together and join as one. The mind ceases being the mind will experience what the heart is like, the heart will experience the mind. What will happen? Destruction. The beauty of a human body is that it's made up of an intricate maze, an intricate amount of details, a myriad of details, different systems, very different from another, but they work perfectly in coordination in a healthy human being. So it's harmony within diversity. God forbid that you want to destroy that bound. You want to destroy the boundary, for example, between the windpipe, the air pipe, and the food pipe. That's destruction. The same thing with other boundaries. These are healthy boundaries that are part of what makes things work in this world. In nature, this is the case as well, where there's the perfect balance between predator and prey, with more prey multiplying in larger numbers than the predators, the perfect boundary between the mineral world, the vegetable world, the animal world, and human beings, of course, can upset that balance. But that is healthy boundaries, the boundaries of existence that allow things to not just survive, but to thrive. An ecosystem that is made up of millions and billions of different components. Think of it like a symphony. And you don't want everybody playing the same instrument. You don't want them playing the same time. You don't want them playing the same sound. Each in its time, in its place, and then coordinated creates beautiful music, beautiful harmony. Same thing with art. So here you see the difference between healthy and unhealthy boundaries. Now here's the big question, as I said earlier. How does this play itself out in the context of boundlessness and infinity and transcendence? So let's talk a little mysticism here, a little Kabbalistic ideas. There's a famous statement from Ibn Gabbai in his classic Kabbalistic work called Avodas HaKodesh, where he says, "Kashem sheyesh lekeiche b'bilti bal gvul, kach yesh lekeiche b'gvul." Just as God has the power to create the infinite, or to extend infinitely, he also has the power of the finite. Because im leikein, if you're saying otherwise, that itself is a limitation. If you say that otherwise, that he's only infinite and not finite, that itself is a limitation. An interesting concept. In other words, the finite is really another expression of the infinite. Because when the infinite, or that which is beyond the infinite and the finite, as we shall discuss, chooses to manifest in a finite manner, that doesn't make him or it finite. It's simply another manifestation of the infinite. Just like a human being, for example, can run at 20 miles an hour and chooses to run at 5 miles an hour, or you can throw a stone, let's say 100 yards, and you choose to throw it 1 yard, that's not a limitation. You chose to do it that way. In the language of Samach Vov, the classic discourse, Hemshech, from the Rebbe Rashab, was delivered in Tofrei Samach Vov, which is the equivalent of 1906, 1905, 1906, a little more than 100 years ago, 100 and, to be exact, 100 and, well, it's 109 years ago. Same time when Einstein came out with his special theory of relativity, that period. So he writes, Hagbola Ritzenis Eina Hagbola. When you confine something, when you limit something by desire, it's not considered a confinement. It's a confinement if it's imposed upon you, but not if you chose it. So we're talking on the divine level now. We'll get back to the humans in a moment, in a few moments. We're talking on the divine level, so basically it's two manifestations. And that's how the Hasidic discourses put it, that there's like two tracks. One is the power of the infinite, think of it like the gas, and the other is the brakes, the power of the finite. And they actually work in tandem, and they both come from the same source, which is the essence, the core, what's called atzmus, which is neither finite nor infinite. Because defining by infinite is just as limiting as defining by the finite, as I said. Because the real limitation is not whether something's infinite or finite. It's saying it's this and not that. As soon as you say something is this and not that, that's a definition and a limitation. So you have an interesting twist. You have finite, you have infinite, and you have that which is beyond the finite and the infinite that can choose to go either direction. And thus the universe was created with a combination of these two forces. A force of energy that has infinite power, choosing to limit that infinite power and into a formal structure. So in essence, from the perspective, from the creator's perspective, from the perspective of the engineer, it's really all infinite. It's just a matter of how it manifests. From the perspective from below, this looks finite and that looks infinite. And I don't mean this as an illusion. It's not an illusion. It actually is finite, but it's not finite in the sense of a limitation. It's finite as another form of expression. So think of an artist. An artist can draw, we'll say, an infinite amount of art. When I say infinite, I mean relatively, because of human limits of time and the years and so on. You can't just say it's actual infinite amount of art. But hypothetically, what stops an artist from drawing as much art as he can, except health or death? He could potentially has the potential to create any type of art and many types of art, if he so chooses. And yet, he decides, I'm going to create one piece of art right now. Is this an expression of his finite power of art or of his infinite power? Infinite again, relatively speaking. The answer is it's an expression of him being an artist. And now he chooses to manifest all that artistry and power into this particular piece of art. This is how Hasidic thought explains this. I've been teaching in the last few years, since it's a centennial, another Hemshech, Ayin Beis, which following the Hemshech of Samach Vov, which was delivered in 1906 through 1908, this one was delivered beginning from the year 1912, going all the way till 1916, 1917, and written even later. By the same Rebbe Rashab, he passed away in 1920. And it's a fascinating analysis, a fascinating, I would say even more than analysis, a fascinating depiction of the internal mechanisms and the map, you can say, the DNA of existence in the context of finite and infinite. And makes a very interesting explanation, interesting presentation on the idea that the infinite possibilities that chooses, shir asmei b'koyach, that chooses to limit itself, to estimate, to allocate a certain amount of resources toward one direction. And that's called, in the Kabbalistic terminology, 10 spheres. The 10 spheres are essentially the 10 building blocks. Think of it, the 10 tools which the divine uses to create structure. And as you may be familiar with them, there are three. These are 10 conscious, I should add. 3 intellectual faculties, chachma, bina, das. It's wisdom, understanding, knowledge, or sometimes concept, comprehension, and resonance, or conclusion, bonding with the idea. And then you have the 7 emotional faculties, or attributes, which are chesed, love, gevura, discipline, tiferet, compassion, yesod, which is netzach, ambition and endurance, determination, hoid, humility or yielding, yesod, foundation, bonding, and malchut, dignity. If you're familiar with my book on the Sfirat Omer, I spell out the last seven times seven, and how they are daily exercises in the days between Passover and Shavuot. But it's really universal all year round. These 10, think of it as the 10 building blocks. Just like we may have, and just like there are in the world, there are 100 and some elements, and there are particular subatomic particles, think of these as the spiritual particles that define all of existence. And the interconnectivity and the different configurations and permutations of these 10, chesed within chachma, chachma within bina, bina within malchus, malchus within yesod, is what creates a diversity of existence. In the words of the Torah, explained in the Shar Yuchad V'Amuna, which is the second section of the Tanya from the Baal Tanya Reb Shneur Zalman of the Yadi, he says, B'asara ma'amaros nivra elam. This is the Mishnah says this. With 10 utterances, with 10 expressions, God created the world. As we see, Yehi Ar, let there be light, Yehi Rakia, let there be a heaven, Teitziar Desha, that the earth should give out vegetation, fourth day, let there be luminaries in the heavens, creation of animals, creation of the human being. So there's the 10 utterances. And yet we see there's far more than 10 objects in this world. There aren't just 10 items. So he explains in Tanya, in Shayach B'Amunah, because these 10 expressions, when you break them down, they have gematrias, they have their numerical, they have permutations, temuras, chilufim, and so on. They have all kinds of ways that they manifest. And they therefore slowly break down into much more than just 10. So 10 building blocks. And of course, we cannot ignore that these 10 associate with the 10 commandments, and of course originate in the 10 spheres. The Pardes, Rab Meir Shekaraviro, his classic work called the Pardes, the Orchard, he explains the relationship between these 10s that I just described, the 10 commandments, the 10 spheres, the 10 utterances. But the bottom line is that there's 10 building blocks. And these 10 building blocks, of course, they occupy a very formidable amount of literature and Kabbalistic and especially Hasidic thought, what their role is and their relationship with their source and with existence. Sometimes they're described as interfaces because the divine is beyond structure, beyond boundaries, beyond definitions and beyond parameters. Existence is made up of parameters and structure and definition. How shall the twain meet? So the spheres play a role in that sense. It's God's paintbrush, his tools. But obviously the spheres are 10 and not more. There's 10 and not 11, 10 and not 9. And yet it says, Esa spheres blima, 10 spheres without substance. Which of course begs the question, which one is it? So in Ayin Beis, and many other places, but Ayin Beis elaborately discusses at length the paradox of the spheres. That on one hand, they define structure. On the other hand, they themselves are not really structured. And there are different opinions among the Kabbalists. Some consider the spheres simply as names that we use for describing infinite light. Think of it like, for example, a colorless water in tinted glass. So the water may appear color, but it's only the glass that really creates the color. So others say, no, the energy itself, in this case the water itself, also has particles and definition. But any way you determine it, and there are many more opinions, bottom line is, and Chassidus explains, all work, it depends on what level you're talking about. But somewhere the question is, where do the 10 meet that which is beyond the 10? And this is the fascinating discussion in Ayin Beis, basically where consciousness meets unconscious, or superconscious, where structure meets beyond structure. And sometimes it's Keser, that sphere that is the crown that is above the other. And Keser itself has in it a bunch of levels as well. So in Ayin Beis he discussed that the spheres have 3 meanings, which really are 3 dimensions. One is sphere from the word number, misper. One sphere from the word sipur, telling a story, a narrative. And the third, the highest, is sphere from the word sapphire, sapphire, which is a transparency, a glow. And he explains that spheres have different elements to them. There's an element where they're just counting. They're specific. Counting, of course, is the ultimate structure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Telling a story is also made up of structure, but it's already telling a deeper story that can be a story beyond structure. And finally, the third level of the spheres is the illumination or the transparency. All they are is reflecting that divine infinite power that chose to express itself in a finite state. And the beauty and elegance of this is that we can climb the ladder from our finite structures and find the story that our finite reality tells, that ultimately leads you to a transparent state, that it ultimately reveals of infinite reality that is beyond the finite. But this is not something that can be done easily, because you have to climb the ladder slowly. It's like, think of it like a child who's starting to learn ideas. Beginning, you spoon feed A, B, C. Then they begin to take the letters and turn them into words. And words become sentences. And sentences become paragraphs. And paragraphs become chapters. And chapters become books. And books become part of a whole literature. And when a person becomes a master, or studies and understands things on a very global level, what's the role of those letters that they began? Without the letters, you would never have gotten there. But the letters, which accumulate into words, which build into sentences, which turn into paragraphs, which transform into chapters, into books, volumes, and so on, convey ideas that are far beyond the letters. Just like when you play musical notes, the music is far more than the sum of the parts of the actual structure of the notes. So you have here a fascinating understanding of how the finite structures, as you climb it and do it properly, step by step, paced well, lead you into an infinite reality that ultimately is an expression of the divine power to do it all. So you see a piece of art, you see a piece of music, and you realize the musician, the composer, or the artist, of course they could have made many different pieces of art, but they chose. God chose in his infinite abilities of doing spheres einkets, unlimited different types of expressions, chose to channel it into 10. And that, and essentially, is the infinite chose to express itself in a finite manner. That finite manner begins to go through a whole process of transmutations and a tzimtzum and an evolution of levels, a quantum leap, until it becomes the root of the finite structures of existence that in our eyes, from the bottom up, seem impenetrable, seem impossible to bridge. We seem all to be individual structures. But the essence is, it all comes from a place that's beyond it all. And from that perspective, the finite is simply another way for the infinite to manifest itself. So the question is, how do we get from here to there? So the New Year celebrations, they express, even if you're going to talk about in a healthy form, a type of just letting it all go, breaking down boundaries. Often it's unhealthy, often leads to unhealthy things, and all kinds of breakdowns. Asar B'Tevis focuses on the building of boundaries and the respect of them. The breaching of the wall began by the siege of the wall. And by making Asar B'Tevis a significant day, you're saying respect the boundaries of existence. Because for you to get beyond boundary, you have to know the boundaries. If you want to transcend the structure, you have to use the structure, or else you're either just deluding yourself or just escaping. So when you look at the art that I described, or the beauty, or music, you'll see it has that paradox. Or take the beauty of nature, or the beauty of the human body. They all are made up of very strict laws. As I said, the windpipe and the food pipe, the heart and the lungs and the mind, and how everything is perfectly symmetrically separated in the human body. Everything has its boundaries. And if the boundary breaks down, where one thing starts seeping, God forbid, into another, it creates destruction. And yet, because they are structured in a healthy way, they can learn to work with each other. Imagine if the windpipe opens up instead of the food pipe when you put food down your mouth. So everything works exactly. It has to close and open in precise precision, in a precision way, and then they all work together like a machine, a well-oiled machine, better than any well-oiled machine, to create one unit called the you. You, your life, your personality. This is ultimately the secret, because you look in life, you'll see that the truth is that these are interconnected. Now, how is that possible? Because as Chassidus explains, it's rooted in the core etzem, the essence, that's beyond structure and beyond non-structure. And thus, when it manifests in this world, you have structure, and ultimate boundaries, and that precisely is what allows you to create a unit that's seamless. And which is, of course, a real paradox, because you'd say, you know what, let me break down the boundaries. That's the way to create seamlessness. No. Maintain them, and then they learn to work with each other. And the same thing is with human beings. 7 billion of us, each individual has a unique role to play, like a unique musical note. And you have to recognize that this musical note is yours and yours alone. It's an indispensable part of who you are. And another note needs to recognize and respect that. And when each one does its role and recognize that they need the other, then you have the symphony. The same thing with all of existence. The unbelievable symbiosis of nature. Any type of system, and all the systems we create, man-made systems, try to emulate that perfect element, where you have so many components, but they're all working together in a symmetrical way. Nature is the best example. From my flesh I behold God. Our human bodies, our human beings, is another perfect example. And you see where there's a breakdown, where there seems to be so-called two things seems to melt together, they can end up creating destruction. So it's precisely the boundaries that allow you to get beyond the boundaries, because they allow you to access the source, which is beyond both of them. And the spheres become a tremendous tool, because they play the role in each level, how you climb from one place to the other. So the question is, how do we climb? Going back first to Asher of Tevis, so the 10th of Tevis emphasizes the importance of the healthy boundaries. And when they are besieged, and the walls were placed under siege, and then ultimately breached, as soon as they're under siege, you already know that's the beginning of the end, so to speak. Now, obviously, there was time and they could have still fortified and protected and so on, but it didn't happen. But as soon as there was the surrounding of the wall, means the wall is in danger of coming down. As soon as the wall is in danger, you don't wait for it to be breached. You don't wait for it to be destroyed. As soon as it's besieged, as soon as it's challenged, as soon as it's placed in danger, you need to act. And that's the same in our lives. That is why in Torah you have so much expression and this understanding of the boundaries of things. Now, sometimes some people take it to extremes, and they get so caught up in it that they don't even think about the necessity to understand the spirit of the boundaries. But at the same time, to ignore them in the name of so-called, I'm reaching into the infinite light, is also not acceptable. So what is the process? The process goes back to one key word that I've discussed many times, and this is the concept of bittul. The real problem, and this is where, as they say, the Hund is bagrab, liegt bagrab, where the dog is buried. It's an expression in Yiddish when you say, where's the culprit? Where's the dog buried, so to speak? And where's the culprit? The culprit is the self. Our obsession with ourselves. Self-interest, conceit, self-glorification, and all that comes with the self. When the self becomes imbalanced in the sense that it's all about me, aniva avsiaid, me and nothing else, what happens? It's no longer a healthy boundary. Now you're creating and most important thing, I'm the center of the universe, and everything orbits around me. So what happens next? One possibility is that others do the same. They dig in, and everybody becomes a self-contained self where we don't need each other, or we don't acknowledge the need for each other. Another thing that happens is that you stop breathing. When there's no interaction with others, and there's no give and take, it's all about you become bloated, psychologically, emotionally, and it's all about me. So what you're doing is you're creating an imbalance. What is bittul? Bittul is fresh air. It's allowing yourself to breathe, recognizing that as a give and take, there's an exhale and inhale. There are others. Yes, you have special qualities, but you have to recognize that there are also others that have. And you need them as much as they need you. And it's not a place of insecurity. Many people, because of their insecurity, become arrogant. It's a place of security when you're secure with yourself. Why not recognize and respect the others? So this goes back to healthy and unhealthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries means, yes, you have a sense, you have an individual sense, but it's not airtight. There are others, and there are other spheres that you need to work with, and recognize that there's a bigger picture. You're part of the picture. You're one musical note. You're one stroke. But you're part of a bigger book, a bigger chapter, a bigger story, a greater choreography. That's when you begin to climb and allow your boundaries to help you reach the boundarylessness. Now, the interesting thing is very simple. If you become so self-contained, that's all about me, right there, your boundary has now completely controlled you. It's completely encircled you. I remember seeing one of these talks on TED Talk. It was a Turkish, I believe a Turkish woman tells that her grandmother was she's a storyteller. Her way of doing things is through storytelling. And she talks about her grandmother, who people would come to, believing in her to fight disease, to develop other things. And her grandmother would always use circles. Like if someone had a disease or a problem, she would draw a circle around the disease, whether it was a physical one or a circle in the sand. And her grandmother told her, why circles? Because circles close something, and when you close something, you kill it. Because ultimately, everything needs fresh air. And type of circle, you close something, you like close it up, you lock it up. Like you see, when you don't have fresh air, on one hand, you could kill disease. On the other hand, you can also kill other things. So the idea that we are enclosed, that's an unhealthy boundary, where maybe it can work for diseases and so on. But for healthy life, you need to have your identity, but you also need to breathe. That's why we exhale and inhale. We don't just inhale and say, okay, the rest of my life I'll live with that breath. Is an importance of an exhale and inhale, contract and expand. Interacting. Imena nili mili, as Hillel said, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But then he says, but if I'm only for myself, what am I? So it's understanding that you are a unique individual and you have healthy boundaries, but not boundaries that become walls to the point that nobody can get in, nobody can get out. If you do that, paradoxically, that's what limits you most. And paradoxically, the other way around. That when you have healthy boundaries and recognize that that you leave room for fresh air, another opinion, another way of looking at things. Think of how marriage works. You marry someone that's not like yourself, someone from a different family, a different gene pool, a stranger. That's the whole beauty of it, that first of all, even on a basic health level, it eliminates diseases, it dilutes any type of strains that may cause all kinds of, God forbid, genetic problems and so on. For example, in many of the royal families in the 18th, 19th century, hemophilia was very popular, was very prevalent, I should say, because there was a lot of intermarrying, meaning the same gene pool. So just on that level, it creates a certain type of diversity that continues to multiply. And all healthy things are based on an incubation and based on a cross-pollination of different forces. The greatest ideas are collaborative. Today we see that more than ever. This still does not take away from your individuality, because what you're contributing is unique to you. So then, the paradox is, as your boundaries are healthy, but they are porous. They're not in the sense where they completely disappear. They're walls, but there's a gates that go in and out, and you can interact with others. That creates the ability to start experiencing another way of looking at things, another way of seeing things. And then together with others, you start seeing more and more and more, till you start seeing the infinite. So it's the finite structure that allows you to see the infinite. If the finite becomes too finite, meaning too closed up and enclosed, there's no way out. If you lose all those boundaries, there's also no way out, because everything is everything and there's just destruction. So it's the structures that were put in place by the 10 spheres that are necessary. And then you climb and you look and recognize what another sphere has to say. Chesed listens to Gvura, Gvura listens to Chesed. They give and take, and the same thing with the other spheres, and the same thing can be applied in our personal lives. And that slowly, a combination of all the spheres interacting, allow them to see into the superconscious, which is Keser, beyond the conscious, which opens up the door to the infinite artist that initially put the whole thing in place by taking the infinite and channeling it into the finite. And to a point where you can come to understand that finite and infinite are simply two tracks, or even beyond that, one source that simply manifests in two different ways. The ability to be infinite, the ability to be finite. The ability to shine, the ability to withhold, which both creates, number one, a type of aggressive and outgoing energy, and another, what we'll call more feminine-like, intimate and internalized type of energy. So at the end of the day, that's the story of Asar B'Tevis. I found it extremely intriguing that coincides this year with New Year's, which is so much symbolized by this type of reckless or even frivolous lack of boundaries, and then until, of course, the hangover ends the next morning or whenever it ends. and more of like a type of escape, of just type of bursting out of all the boundaries simply to free ourselves, relieve the relief necessary from a very difficult life. When in truth, what Judaism offers us is a system, is a systemized way that, yes, there are times where you need to break away. There's a Simchas Torah, there's a Purim. There are times where you, even in daily life or once a week and so on, you need to experience something more transcendent. But it's a constant dance between the transcendent and the immanent, between what's called the transcendent, the makif, and the pnimi, where the structure is constantly there as a structure, but always being fine-tuned and refined to be able to receive that which is beyond structure, which is the ultimate goal, to connect with the divine that is beyond gvul and beyond bli gvul in that sense. So here we are in a Asar B'Tevet, which on one hand is a sad day, but on the other hand it reminds us of something extremely important today. What does it remind us? It reminds us of the need for healthy boundaries. And that is not because boundaries are necessary in life simply because that's the way we're structured. It's necessary to find that which is beyond boundaries, because that which is the boundaries are ultimately part of the infinite power to create the finite. And respecting that is just as much as respecting the infinite. That's why in Judaism you have the concept of a mitzvah, an actual act or deed. Now some mitzvahs are mitzvahs in thought, some are mitzvahs with your speech, and some in action. You have mitzvahs connected to the heart, loving another. V'haftarecha kamocha. V'haftas Hashem Elokecha, loving God. Awe, faith, trust. So there are many mitzvahs that are more so-called emotional ones or spiritual ones. But the primary mitzvahs are mitzvahs maisis. They're actions. And if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, you'll find intricate detail, almost obsession, of how every little thing has to be done. When exactly Shabbat begins and when it ends. What's considered work on Shabbat? Passover. What are the specific details of what is considered how you make a matzah? And what would make a matzah no longer kosher? The same thing with tefillin, the same thing with mezuzah. The precision, it's to the extent of precision, even more than surgical precision, of every detail counts. And we know in surgery or in outer space, every detail counts because it's life and death. So details are not because we're obsessed with details, but because the structure of existence dictates details. But the question is, if it's so many details, isn't that confining and limiting and constraining and restraining and not letting us be free spirits? The answer is no, because those same details come from the same place that shows the infinite, that shows the finite. This is an artist choosing precision. The precision of the human body, or the precision of nature, or the precision of any type of natural system is part of its infinite power that's simply manifesting and channeling itself in the finite. So how do you release the infinite power of the finite? By doing a mitzvah. You have money. Money is a very limited thing. First of all, it's material. Everything made of matter has limits. It dies, it erodes, it weakens, it diminishes. Right? Money has to be spent. Just like yesterday's meal is digested, you need a new meal the next day, 3 meals a day or whatever it is. So money. So how do you take a finite element like money and turn it into an infinite? You give charity. You take the money, like he says in Tanya chapter 37, money that represents so much chaya nafshe, our lives, because it's our ingenuity, our time, our energy, our intelligence. All that reflected, the money measures your so-called success. And you take some of it, which is so hard to do, and give it to another person. You've suddenly taken the finite and turned it into infinite. You've taken the finite structure and did a mitzvah with it. So a mitzvah is the perfect combination of finite structures. Every mitzvah is with its particular precision, as I said. Tefillin, mezuzah, Sefer Torah, Shabbat, holidays, kosher. They're all precision. They all say this and not that. You do it this way, you can't do it that way. Some things are allowed, some things are not allowed. All the different shiurim, the measurements, the time period. Shabbat is its time. When you pray, there's a time for prayer. You can't say, hey, I missed prayer today, I'll do twice prayer tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. Because the confines and structures of time and space are part of reality. And we value it. And we don't just say, hey, what difference does it make? It's all infinite anyway. No, because the infinite chose the finite. If it didn't choose the finite, you'd be right. But the infinite chose this finite entity, this individual, you. are part of that infinite picture. If you cease being you, then suddenly the whole thing is compromised. So that's the paradox. It's the structure that reflects the beyond structure. And that's why mitzvahs play such an important role. It's not just a meditation into the infinite, it's taking the infinite and expressing it in a material world. So a finite world with structure is redeemed and transcendent and reach the greatest, highest places by taking the structure and using it for something with bittul beyond itself, beyond its own needs, beyond its own definition. And that's ultimately what a mitzvah is. You take a finite element of the structure, you take a piece of food, which is necessary for you to eat because you cannot survive without it. This particular piece of food will break down into particular minerals and vitamins that will turn into your flesh and blood and will sustain you and nourish you and nurture you and so on. And you make a blessing on this food. You release through thereby sparks, spiritual sparks that connect with your soul. That in turn the soul and your body can go ahead and help somebody. You do something with the energy that you gain from that meal, from that food, and suddenly you're helping the world. And you're leaving a permanent impact on the universe, whereas you could have just been a meal that came and went. And all of the universe was waiting for that moment that you eat that little particular detail in its finite parameters and turn it into some type of infinite permanent energy. I've shared many times the beautiful story with Rabbi Baal Shem Tov and Mordechai Chaim Rappaport, who was a tzaddik of the time, and he sent him on a mission. He came back, and the Baal Shem Tov wanted to know what direction, what way did he travel, which seemed to be a trivial, a detail. So he began to explain, and the Baal Shem Tov wanted to know all the details. So he said, well, the first night I slept in an inn, the next night I traveled down this road. There was no inn, so I slept at the side of the road. I woke up in the morning, I washed my hands, said my prayers, then sat down to eat something. And there was a brook of water, a spring of water at the edge of the road. I went over and I took a cup of water, made a blessing, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, shehakol niya b'dvarei, that everything is created with dvarei, with His word, with God's word. And I drank the water. And the Baal Shem Tov jumped up with excitement and said, from the beginning of time, from the beginning of Sheshes Yemei Bereshis, the 6 days of creation, that spring of water was waiting for you to come and make a blessing on it. This is the finite becoming infinite. We have that opportunity in every step that we take. God leads our footsteps. Even things that you haven't planned, wherever you go. It may be a finite detail, it may be trivial in your mind, it may be insignificant, but there's a choreography, a mysterious choreography taking place. That in every finite entity lies a mysterious power of the infinite. But how do you release it? By doing something not just for your own needs, not just indulging, by doing something that takes that and catapults it into the world of the infinite. So you're taking that piece of the puzzle, that sphere, that piece of art, that one component, the finite component, and revealing that it's all part of an infinite choreography of a far greater power. But that's only on condition that you do something with it that has that type of benefit. You made a blessing. You helped somebody. You did a deed that's outside of your own interests. If you close the circle and your wall is so locked up that you don't have any interaction, and it's all about me, and there's no redeeming element of doing a mitzvah, of doing a good deed, of breathing fresh air, then you're trapped in the finite and you cannot escape. So we have that option before us every day, every moment. So the 10th of Teves, even though it reminds us of the sad siege of Jerusalem, it also reminds us the importance of the walls in our lives, of the boundaries. And it's not by eliminating boundaries completely that we achieve boundlessness. It's by respecting them, by respecting the space, by respecting the borders in a healthy way. Not overdoing it in the sense where it becomes so closed. By respecting these boundaries, that allows us to experience that which is the boundless, the temple which was inside. And when they besieged the wall and then they breached it, it ultimately led to the destruction. So it's the walls that are necessary. And then there comes a point when Mashiach comes which says, Proses Teshav Yerushalayim, that Yerushalayim will sit in openness, will no longer need walls. What does that mean? As he continues there, that the walls will not be walls of stone, they'll be walls of fire. Think of that. Boundaries, but of fire. Very different than walls of stone that are barriers. Walls of fire means that the boundaries are there, but the boundaries are not boundaries, they're boundaries of light, which would be the equivalent of an energy itself. You have waves, you have protons, you have electrons, you have neutrons, you have all the different types of subatomic particles. So you still need structure, but the structure is made of light. Think of that, like sphera from the word sapir, not just sphera from the word number, which is real defined structure. Within the number lies something deeper, the story of telling a deeper story, a narrative. But you ultimately come to a point where the spheres themselves, the 10 spheres themselves, become sphereless, so to speak. So we learn to express the inexpressible. We learn to structure. The structures learn to teach us how to get beyond structure. Boundaries lead us to places that are beyond boundaries. And that's the ultimate fusion, where you have the ability of the bligvul and the gvul joining together. But this is a process that, number one, has taken a long time in history to get to. Generations and generations working with the finite, working with the structure, refining it, like I mentioned before. Words, letters become words become sentences become paragraphs, chapters, volumes, and they start telling a story of a choreography of a magnificent and exquisite nature that is far beyond any structure. But it's structure that tells us the story of beyond structure. This is, my friends, the relevance of 10th of Tevis to our personal lives. And it couldn't come at a better time, the same night where the world, at least the Western world, is celebrating this type of breakout of all their limitations and without necessarily any real results, only to remember that the next year, New Year's Eve, is another party, whereas what we're talking about is a sustainable and a permanent approach to taking the structure of our lives and turning it to that which is beyond structure, which is the ultimate point of the 10th of Tevis. And as the Cheskel says, that when Mashiach comes and we finally find that place where the two meet, the structure meets beyond structure, and you'll have the walls of fire, then you'll have Yehavchi Yom HaMelus, when these days will be transformed, the Sasnal Simcha, joyous days, and Moedim Tovim, and holidays. So sadness, which also is a confining experience, suddenly becomes transformed to joy. Because when you can find the infinite, when you can find how sadness is a springboard to lead you to greater things, Hazerim Bedima, when you sow with tears, then you reap with joy. So even tears, the confining element of tears and sadness and loneliness, can end up becoming a Echa Yoshva Badad, as the city sat lonely when it was destroyed. Echa, as Yirmiyahu says in his Lamentations, Echa, he talks about woe, which we say Tisha B'Av Eve. Woe to the city that sits alone, with its walls breached, with its walls destroyed, alone. And from that loneliness, you can turn it into a transformation of joy. Then you take again the greatest limitations and turn them into greatest assets. Something the Jews have mastered, and something that all of us, when we really know how to create a holistic approach to life, and you realize that everything is part of a bigger cycle, and don't allow yourself to think that sadness or sad events is the end of the story. It's not. It's part of a larger story. And we have to see it through. As we see it through, it all becomes part of a far greater infinite picture. Oitcha Hashem Kianaftabi, we will be able to even praise God for the afflictions that we suffered in this period of time. So God should bless everybody, that we should only have good news to share, and take your boundaries, turn them into things that are beyond boundaries. But by respecting the structure, by respecting the space, that's how you do it. In relationships, for instance, it's not the fact that the spouses have boundaries can become a wall between them where they cannot communicate, they can't really have a relationship. On the other hand, if they have no space, if they don't have boundaries, they lose their identities. It's critical in the relationship where you have Ava and Yira, you have a closeness that melts away any differences, but that does not compromise the individuality that each has. As the Kotzker Rebbe says, and I've quoted a number of times, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am not and you are not. But if I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, I am and you are. In other words, your identity has to be defined and generated from within. And when you're secure in your own identity, then you will be, and you will allow another to be. If identities start searching elsewhere for defining themselves, then that meltdown of boundaries, that lack of individuality ultimately destroys and is damaging. So God should bless everyone to have both their healthy boundaries and recognize that they should not be completely locked up but you should have those openings, the fresh air of working together with others and collaborating, cross-pollination, and ultimately it's a combination of fusion of boundaries that lead us to beyond boundaries. So again, this class has been dedicated in honor of Gabriel upon his 19th birthday, 9th of Tevet, which is today, going into the 10th of Tevet, for his strength, courage, and giving so much nachas, and dedicated by his loving mother, Goldie. So until next Wednesday, when we will continue this series of Wednesday Night Live, which will be at 8:15 Wednesday, everyone should have a very blessed week, a good year, a good new year in a way that doesn't just last over for one night or one day, but one that actually brings blessings to all of us personally and collectively in a way where we both can experience our individuality while also joining together in the large cosmic symphony and magnificent story and narrative of our history and of our lives, and of our communities and of our individual selves and families. Everyone should have a very blessed and good week. Thank you.